Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to give a quick talk about 4 steps to manage authentication. I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder and CEO of Glue, a software vendor in the digital identity space. I'm also the host of the podcast Open Source Underdogs, where it's a business podcast where we talk to 50 plus founders and leaders of open source companies and how they're using open source as part of their business model. And I'm also the author of the APRESS book, Securing the Perimeter, which talks about how to build an open source identity infrastructure for your enterprise. So a lot of companies are moving away from passwords and trying to what I call lock the front door, which means that they're trying to prevent fraudulent logins because a large percentage of the hacks that happen out there, the root cause is bad person authentication. And so you can really eliminate a whole swath of attacks if you just do a better job authenticating. So everyone knows passwords is bad. So when you're looking to improve the authentication, security at your company, the first thing you want to do is say, okay, which of these new authenticators do we want to use other than passwords? Um, so, um, everyone has an email address and a mobile phone. So sending a one-time token via email and SMS is pretty common. Social login providers like Google and Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, actually do a pretty good job protecting your credentials. And if somebody can consistently show, control of a certain social IDP account, that's a good indicator of identity. There's old standards like for OTP, a standard called Oath, which is HOTP and TOTP. You've used this if you've used Google Authenticator or some other type of hardware token with a little changing numbers. This is still popular. We have enterprise federated login. So your company or your university or your organization might have a SAML IDP or an OpenID Connect provider where you have a company account, and you might use that to log in to some website. And then we get into some new authenticators. So FIDO is a number of authentication technologies that enables you to use a USB key, like a YubiKey, um, and also to connect your device, whether that's a phone or a laptop, to the browser. So there's also a FIDO interface using Bluetooth. So potentially you could log in with your phone, where your phone makes a Bluetooth connection to your laptop, um, giving the browser access to call to key operations and in the phone. Platform authenticators. So, for example, Touch ID on the iPhone, or I have a MacBook Air, and there's a Touch ID integrated into my laptop. So biometric sensors that are built into the hardware are becoming more common. NFC, there is an NFC FIDO interface. We don't see it used too much yet. Um, and finally, smart cards. So if you're a U.S. federal employee, you probably have a government issued smart card. There are lots of EIDAS regulations around smart card interoperability in Europe, and smart cards are still around, and there's still a lot of care goes into issuing them, so they're good authenticators. So these authenticators I've been talking about are really they are ones that you don't have to license, but there's also a bunch of authentication services out there which you can normally um, subscribe to these services on a per user per month. Services like Duo Security, Transmit, Stitch, Hyper, um, Magic, etc. In Weibo. There's a number of them, and they mostly do a good job at this, and offer good services. And so anyway, so the first job you have, if you're a company that says we want to improve authentication, is to figure out which of these authentication mechanisms do you want to offer? And there's no silver bullet. Like, people will have a lot of different devices, and depending upon the device they have, one authenticator or another might be better. So it would be great if everyone could use, FIDO platform authenticators, but not everyone has an iPhone or a MacBook Air. So you might say, well, if you're using, an Android phone, we want to use Bluetooth. If you're using an iOS phone, we'll use, FIDO platform authenticators. And if you're in a really old, Windows laptop from, that has none of these sensors, maybe we'll use OTP. So I think that a lot of the times, the right authenticator depends upon, it's about risk mitigation, not perfection. And what is the right authenticator we choose based upon the risk of the transaction, the cost of rolling out that technology across our organization, and sort of the security properties of the authenticator. So, okay, so let's just assume you pick a couple of these authenticators. So step two, after we picked our authenticators, is to offer self-service authenticator lifecycle. That means we need to give users a way to enroll credentials. And Google does a very good job at this. You should study how they enable end users to manage two-step verification. Google is a product called Casa. That's the product I'm showing to the right. And this is actually a picture of my profile. And you can see I have a whole lot of FIDO devices registered. And the idea here is that we want to let people register a backup credential. FIDO does not enable you to export the private key that's built into the hardware and into, even whether it's platform or USB. So if we can't register or export our private key to back it up, we need to have multiple keys that let us in. So if I lose one key and I have another key, it's not a problem. I just log in with my backup key and remove the old key. So it sort of normalizes the idea that I'll always be getting a new phone or a new laptop, or I'll be losing, these little USB keys are great. They're also really easy to lose. So that's a natural sort of like life cycle event. And that doesn't require an administrator to get involved, as long as a person doesn't lock themselves out. But this is one of the biggest barriers to adoption of two-factor authentication, is because companies and organizations know how to how to deal with a lost password. You send an email or you call an administrator, but how do you deal with the account recovery for some of these stronger credentials is a big challenge. And I think that self-service must be a part of the equation. And there are open source tools like Casa that help you give this self-service capability to end users. Okay, step three. So now we have these great authenticators and people can manage them. How do our applications utilize them? And so, not surprisingly, I'm going to say use open standards here. So applications, if they're authenticating people, should use OpenID Connect. If there's anything new, should be OpenID Connect. And so OpenID Connect supports a range of security profiles, from very secure to very insecure. So you need to sort of pick which features of OpenID Connect, or SAML for that matter, you're going to use. But OpenID Connect is always about people. It's a digital identity layer. So we're talking about authenticating people. If you have to authenticate machines, there's a lot of machine-to-machine software processes out there. And so we call that back-channel authentication. So for machine-to-machine, you don't need OpenID Connect because there's no person. So we're just going to use OAuth there. So how you authenticate the client is important. API key and secret is basically a symmetric secret, a shared secret. And if you want asymmetric secrets, you should move to private key authentication when the client acquires the token. So there's some implications here for like how well do you authenticate not only the people, but also the software in your ecosystem. Oops, sorry. Um, and okay, and then SAML. So I mentioned SAML. It's okay if it's a SaaS or legacy application and that's all it supports. It's better than than nothing. But SAML should be deprecated at this point. So no new SAML for sure. And then with authentication interfaces, you might have to think about some of these non-web use cases, although most mobile applications are also web these days. Older things like how do I get Wi-Fi access? How do I get VPN access? How do I log into there's actually some good hooks from OpenID Connect to these backend systems. For example, for SSH access, there's the open source teleport system that you might look at. Anyway, there are some ways to maybe bring OpenID Connect to these non-web use cases, but you also need to consider them, but don't let them drive your decision for what to do. Eventually these will be aligned with the identity standards. Um, so now you've chosen some strong authenticators, hopefully FIDO among them. Um, you've enabled users to register their credentials. You've hooked up your applications. Aren't you done? And so the answer is maybe, but it's, as the user uses your web application, we can collect more data and implement what we call continuous adaptive authentication. We can step up authentication. Um, we can collect a bit of information during authentication. For example, we can look at typing. How do they type their username and password? What do their mouse movements look like? Um, and other information that we might be able to get from this phone. Um, maybe smell. No, just kidding. But I like to point this out because it shows how advanced dogs are, and because they always know. But we have other contextual information. A lot of times we'll say, "Oh, this is a new browser you're using. That makes it more risky." We can look at the IP address. We can back into geolocation. We can look at fraud scores. So some of these things we can actually do as we're interacting with the user in an authentication workflow. We want to definitely that authentication event's really important. So we want to look at that really closely. But even after we've decided to authenticate the client and send back an assertion to the software system that the person is using, we might still want to collect data, and using OAuth and requesting OAuth access tokens consistently, we can keep sending data to the central authentication authorization system and getting more information about whether we should maybe re-authenticate the user based upon risky transactions or what they're doing. So that is it for my slides. Just to sort of wrap up, I'll say that digital identity is a competitive advantage. It helps you get new products to market faster. Every system that you build is going to need to solve this question. So getting good at digital identity will enable you to build new products faster and build better products that are more aware of the people who are interacting with them. And Glue is based on open source software. The Casa is an Apache 2 licensed project hosted at the Glue Federation GitHub. You can join that project. The core Glue OpenID software is developed at a Linux Foundation project called the Jansen Project. And if you're interested to join that, we'd love to have you. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.